everybody. Welcome back to the American Juche Study Group. My name is Noah Shank, and I'm the founder of it. I'm a Korean American, and I'm also an anti-imperialist activist. And I'm also the editor of this new text, Juche for American Workers, Volume 1, which we're almost at the end of, actually. And it compiles the writings of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-Il, and it's also going to be the text that we have been using for our weekly study sessions. The American Juche Study Group is a broad initiative, including people of all races, religious backgrounds, and political affiliations who are interested in learning the ideology of the Korean Revolution. We bring with us a spirit of intellectual charity and goodwill toward all humankind. We refuse to accept the hateful caricature of North Korea presented in American media and instead want to learn the ideas that have held the DPR together for so long, enabled it to withstand circumstances that would most certainly cause any other government on earth to fall. We come with open minds and diversity of thought and share one goal: peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula in the context of a world without war and poverty, in which every nation is enabled to grow and thrive to its fullest. One thing that we'd like to ask, that if you're studying with us today, and I'd also like to remind people that it is an open study session. You're free to join at any time through the link in the chat and in the description. So if you have input that you think we might find valuable, or even if you just want to hang out, that's openly available. But we would like that if you are watching at home, or if you feel the need to join, that you just donate $5 as a small contribution to support the work that we do at the Center for Political Innovation, because we really, really do a whole lot to support peace and anti-imperialism in our time. We are the anti-imperialist organization in America. We are the pro-North Korea organization in America. We are the pro-Russian organization in America. We are the pro-China, the pro-Iranian organization. We're the pro-American organization in America. So there you go. So I think without further ado, we can get into it. So the text that we're going to be talking about today is on the Juche idea. It's by Kim Jong-Il, and it's an excerpt from a seminar that was given on the 70th anniversary of the great leader Kim Il-sung. That would have been March 31st, 1982. It's also worth noting that at this time they would have been using the Juche calendar. 2023 or 2024, North Korea came off of the Juche calendar. The Juche calendar every year starts on the birth date of Kim Il-sung. So this would have also been the beginning of the year. So it's the beginning of the year, and Kim Il-sung is Kim Jong-Il is sort of rallying the troops, right? Sort of getting people really excited. It's the 80s, and during the 1980s, North Korea was really having a boon in, the fervency, I guess, of ideology. We were really revving up. They were really revving up the population to be really, really super communist and really, really pro-Juche. So in the context of this, he's sort of giving an overview of like, hey, this is like the basics of what we believe. So I think we're going to split this text into two parts, because the first is he talks about where does Juche come from. That's the first part. And then the second part, he's going to be talking about sort of the philosophical origins of Juche, and that's going to be quite deep. That'll be next week's session. He's going to be talking about spiritual foundations and materialism. It's going to get really deep. I think that will take a long time. And unfortunately, it's in the second half, and I didn't want to skip over the history of where Juche comes from. So anyway, we can get into our first quote. So basically he says, "Happy birthday, Dad. Happy birthday, Kim Il-sung. It's just so great that we have this ideology called Juche that's guiding us and keeping our country together." And then afterwards, it's important that we train people in this ideology, that we have this ideology. And he basically explains where an ideology comes from. He says, "A progressive idea plays an important role in socio-historical progress. When the popular masses are guided by a progressive idea, they can be a powerful creator of history. Of course, it does not mean that all progressive ideas play the same role in socio-historical development. Their role is different according to how they represent the aspirations and interests of the popular masses, and how correctly they show the path which must be followed in struggle." He continues, "There were ideas which reflected the aspirations of progressive classes of societies even before the emergence of the working class, before the emergence of the proletariat. But due to the historical and class limitations, the trends of thought in the past could not but be hampered in the role they played in social development. I think that's super interesting. So he's talking about like, where does a progressive idea come from? And first of all, I think we should denote what progressive means, because in today's society, for whatever reason, like progressive has become a buzzword for like meaning super uber liberal, right? A lot of people say, "Oh, I'm a progressive. I have really progressive values." And what they mean is like, I'm super into whatever LGBT, or I'm a Democratic Party activist. I'm really pro-abortion or something like that. And you can make an argument that some of those things may be quote unquote progressive, but what progressivism really means when we talk about progressive in the Marxist sense of the word, right? We had a short discussion before we started the show about, Marxists are always changing the definitions of words, but, in the Marxist sense of the word, when we talk about progressivism, what we're talking about is objective markers of historical progress. We're talking about an idea, a progressive idea in the Marxist sense of the word, is an idea that moves history forward. In the objective sense of the word. And when we talk about the progress of history, we're talking about the physical relations of the economy. We're talking about the means of production. So, for example, an anti-colonial struggle, right, that is objectively progressive. Anti-racism is objectively progressive because we have this Leninist understanding, right, that that it is the colonial mode of production, it is imperialism that is keeping the people of the world poor, and that the struggle of oppressed people and the liberation of oppressed nationalities, that out of that would become the liberation of the means of production and socialism, right? That is an example of something that gets coded as progressive that is objectively progressive. But something that's coded as progressive that is not progressive, for example, I can think of is like the green stuff that gets really pushed, right? The Malthusian degrowth, liberal sort of activism pushed by the Rockefellers. A lot of people hear that and they're, oh, well, that's coded as liberal, right? And the quote unquote left in America is constantly pushing, solar panels, and we need to get off of, yeah, but that's not objectively progressive. In fact, that's objectively reactionary. And we're talking about it in the Marxist sense of the word, because these words don't just mean liberal and conservative. They have real meanings that refer to the means of production and the expansion of production. So it looked like somebody had something to say.
Well, I just wanted to add, actually, I think that this point about what does progress mean is probably one of the biggest questions. That's kind of an essential point in Marxism, right? Is that history is marching forward. The human beings are constantly rising toward a higher plane, a higher mode of production, from hunter-gatherer civilization to the Asiatic mode of production, to slavery, to feudalism, to capitalism, and then ultimately to the socialism, or the lower stage of communism, to the higher stage of communism, right? And what's interesting is, at the time that Marx was writing, that was kind of universally understood, the idea of progress. Whereas, first of all, now most of the left does not believe in progress. They believe we need to regress, that we have too much stuff. We need to go back to nature, right? Most of the left thinks that imperialism brings progress to third world people, but somehow that's bad, right? Whereas the whole Leninist critique of imperialism is that imperialism holds back the productive forces. It keeps countries from developing their electrification, from developing their economy, right? And it's not that these are beautiful people living in nature and then, the evil Western man comes and forces his modern ways upon them. It's actually the opposite. It's that the imperialists are keeping these countries underdeveloped as captive markets, and these countries want electrification. And what they do in revolutions is build power plants and, wipe out illiteracy, et cetera, right? But we have this kind of like, the left has adopted this narrative of, it's kind of like the movie Avatar, where it's like the noble savages thing, and it's like progress is bad, right? So there's that. The other thing, though, is that increasingly also you get voices from the anti-imperialist countries that also question progress. Alexander Dugin maintains there's no such thing as historical progress. He says he's neither reactionary nor progressive, right? And he says that the past, the present, and the future are equal. And that's a big part of the fourth political theory that Alexander Dugin, who is very pro-North Korea, puts forward. He's very, very pro-North Korea. And he's respected in Chinese media, even though China very strongly believes in historical progress. Dugin says the past, the present, and the future are equal. And that the notion of historical progress is a Western-centric idea, right? What's also interesting, I'll just mention, is that Marx described himself as a Promethean, and he was really into the myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and gave man the ability to make fire, right? And he saw like man's struggle to have technology as like a great breakthrough. Marx, he actually called himself a Promethean, which I think is very interesting. And so he saw progress as tied up with rebellion. And tied up with kind of opposition to divinity, right? The gods were preventing man from getting fire, so Prometheus rebelled against the gods and and I think in the Greek myth he was horrendously tortured or something. It was like he was like pecked apart by birds, and then they would regenerate his body, and he'd be pecked apart again or something like that. But it was like he had given humans the ability to make fire. So I don't know. It's all very interesting, but yeah, historical progress is very central to what I believe. It's also pretty central to innovationism. It's very clearly very central to Juche. So I just wanted to mention all of that. Yeah.
Well, I think too, Prometheus, I mean, he wasn't a human, right? It's a slightly different creation myth, right? He was a Titan, actually. So like the Titans came before the gods, and then the Titans, their children were the gods, right? But then the Titans were really corrupt and evil, right? And so it's like this cyclical thing, right? And the gods created, and then Prometheus helped the gods to defeat the Titans. And that's why he was rewarded by being able to keep his body and stuff like that and not be tortured. But then the gods created humanity, and the humans were empowered with this godlike potential, but they had no way to realize it, and they had no way to keep cold, and so Prometheus gave them fire, but because he disobeyed Zeus, he was punished. So that's the Promethean myth, and I think the LaRouche people, they still call themselves Prometheans, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, the split from the Schiller Institute. They were originally called LaRouche Pack, but then they were sued by Helga Zepp LaRouche for using her husband's name, so now they're called Promethean Pack, and they call themselves Prometheans.
And I don't know that the thing about
let Jessica, and then Gavin. Yeah.
Oh no, let Gavin go. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. I don't know that the thing about, I mean, taking fire from the gods is necessarily supposed to be anti-clerical or anything like that. I mean, it could just be more of a, taking the power away from illegitimate authorities.
I just wanted to speak about the left because I was at the climate march and I was giving out flyers like always. And of course, no one wants to take my flyers. And I made the point of who was financing the climate march in New York. And when you look, it's Allegheny Coal, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America was involved in mountaintop removal, all these wonderful countries, BP, ExxonMobil. And so you have this left that talks about how it supports third world countries, but then it was demanding this green initiative. Well, the green initiative means that countries in the third world then cannot have electricity. They cannot develop because they don't have the technology to go beyond coal and oil, which is what they use. So it's about underdeveloping the third world. I mean, what kind of a left is that is demanding that the third world not develop? So I completely agree. And now, of course, you have the hypocrisy, right? That promoting data centers. Oh, so we can waste all that water and electricity and energy and data centers, but not in developing infrastructure and having a better life for everyone.
Yeah, and I think of like when Obama went to Africa and he said, if you guys start having ACs and cars like we have in America, the world will burst into flames. We can't have that.
Yeah, I've got the clip. Actually, do you want to see the clip?
Yes, I would very much like
to. Yeah, here we go.
Africa. We're going to all have to work together to find ways in which collectively we reduce carbon, but we make sure that there's some differentiation so that countries that are very wealthy are expected to do more, and countries that are still developing, obviously they shouldn't be resigned to poverty simply because, the West and Europe and America got there first. That wouldn't be fair. But everybody's going to have to do something. Everybody's going to have to make some important choices here. And, I expect that it's going to be your generation that helps lead this, because if we don't, it's going to be your generation that suffers the most. Ultimately, if you think about all the youth that everybody's mentioned here in Africa, if everybody's raising living standards to the point where everybody's got a car and everybody's got air conditioning and everybody's got a big house, well, the planet will boil over unless we find new ways of producing energy.
Yep. That's
It actually,
Obama.
I will say this, it actually sounded kind of reasonable to me at first, but at the end, he lost me when he was talking about people shouldn't have, houses and AC and cars. That's ridiculous. And I remember since I was a kid, they've been saying, scientists are absolutely sure that in a few years, if we don't stop carbon emissions, the world's going to blow up and stuff. It has gotten, I do think that, I don't want to turn this Juche session into about climate change, but I guess maybe I have maybe I have a middle ground position on this, but I think that his degrowth solution is not the answer. We need to pursue fusion and fission and all that.
Yeah,
I mean,
I would.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Jessica.
No, to me, the greatest laugh is that the data centers in the United States use more electricity than the whole entire planet right now. Okay? So, it's the height of hypocrisy. They can have all the air conditioners and building of homes in Africa. That's not an issue. We can just cut down on some data centers. How's that? Come on. I'm sorry.
We
By
could
the way,
get rid of
Cuba right
Netflix
now,
and its imperialist propaganda, which is
Yeah.
just as bad as a data center.
by the way, you know what's going on in Cuba, right? They've cut off the energy. There's no energy there. No one is talking about that. How do you refrigerate food? How do you move food from one area to another?
Jessica,
So,
everybody knows that that's just because communism is just so bad. So, that we have to make them suffer with horrible, inhuman sanctions and commit genocide against them, so that they learn that it's just that their government's just so bad.
Yeah.
Yep. Communism doesn't work, and we will bomb communist countries until they learn it.
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of like along the lines of what Gavin was saying about the condescension in the very clever way that Obama worded that, where he starts off sounding kind of rational and reasonable, but then he changes it to a really Malthusian frame. And it sounds like that speech is given in Africa, or at least to an audience of African dignitaries. And I think it's so condescending and insulting.
Yeah, it was in South Africa at the African Youth Summit.
Yeah, so it's just Malthusian. I wonder how much the audience bought into that. Like, do people in Africa actually trust Obama? I sure wouldn't if I were from there.
Yeah, he's a very, very slick politician. He's very, very skilled. And in many ways it's kind of un-American, they fawned over how eloquent Obama was, but it's kind of un-American. Americans are very plain spoken, We're not those like fancy pants Europeans with their big words, we're plain spoken and we say what we mean, So, but I think we can move on to the next quote. So it can be said that the history of the communist movement, spanning 100 and scores of years, is a history of working class leaders creating and developing revolutionary ideas, and history in which these ideas have been applied to transform the world. It's kind of like it's an interestingly idealist take. That's not something you would expect. He's saying, oh, well, these leaders, they came up with ideas, and because they spoke to the masses in such a way, right, it transformed the world. And, people say, people talk about Marxist as this like strict materialist. But I also think, like, what's his most famous quote? What's inscribed on Marx's grave, right? Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. And I think that's some of the beauty of of Marxism and as an ideology, is that it empowers, ordinary people to try and change the world. That's really a really beautifully human concept. Because it's interesting. You have the history of German idealism, right? You had the empiricists, right? And they were the first materialists. They were the first bourgeois philosophers. They emerge in Britain, right? And they say, oh, well, you can't really change anything. There's nothing to be changed because, the world is just sort of this mathematical equation. You have no agency, right? If you go to a college in America, that's what they tell you, in mathematics classes and stuff like that. It's just like, it's a random assortment of atoms of matter that just sort of stuff happens. And, the only reason you think that you can think anything is because your, brain is firing electrons that have been predestined to fire in a certain way millions and millions of years ago. Right? And then you have Descartes, and he says, well, I think, therefore I am. Right. And so actually, reality is what I make of it. And you have the German idealists, and they say, oh, well, it's kind of complicated. But, the German idealists, they're called the German idealists, Kant and Hegel, and et cetera. But if you get into the bones of what they really thought, none of them really thought that you had influence over reality. That's a common misconception. People think, well, idealism means that you think that you can shape reality. Well, no, idealists kind of don't believe that there is such a thing as a knowable reality outside of the self. They kind of believe that the self is all there is, but that doesn't really mean that they think that that you can change history. And sort of the beauty of, quote unquote, the dialectics in materialism is that Marx sort of believed it's like, well, by taking for granted that, reality is real, that there is a real world in which I can interact with, that I can have a dialectic with, that I can change history, that human beings have a mastery over their environment in which they can change the world. And I think that's a really gorgeous thing. And it's something that you won't often hear anymore. A lot of people are very disempowered, that you come into contact with. They think everything's sort of, that's an aspect of the conspiracy worldview. I think that it comes out of this like empiricist sort of thing where like everything's sort of set in motion by this grand plan and you have no agency over your life. And I think having an ideology that gives you agency over your life is such a powerful thing. And it's something that's very unspoken of.
I think it's ironic that some hard materialists detest religion, because hard materialism and some kinds of religion are both saying that your outcome is predetermined in a way. We don't have agency because random neurons firing in our brain and all this stuff. There's an irony there, I think.
Right, and I get sort of, it gets back to Marx, I guess, sort of being a Promethean, you could say, right? Marx was all about like human beings should have agency over their lives and agency over the world, and you could say that was tied to some a-religiosity. Although, I think too, it's like people say religion is an idealist thing. I don't agree. I don't agree that religion is an idealist thing because, idealism is saying that all that exists is because I thought it. Right. That I cannot know the world as it really is. All I can know is what I think. I think, therefore I am. Well, that's not really religious at all, because if you believe in God, you don't believe that God exists because I thought of it. Right. You believe that God exists because God exists outside of you and that God, has agency over the world.
Well, my understanding was that religion was like the ultimate form of idealism, where we were created through God thinking us into existence. Like it's not our minds that think reality, it's God's mind that thinks reality. That was my understanding. And that like other forms of idealism, we're saying, well, actually we can think it, but it says that we're a reflection of the thoughts of the divine being.
Yeah, but I mean, it's as far as the debate between sort of rationalists and empiricists that happened in the 19th century and 18th century, which is what we think of when we talk about idealism versus materialism. I mean, that's really not the case. That's not the case as I have studied it, at least. That a lot of idealists sort of, it's their belief that not that, oh, well, God exists or something like that. A lot of idealists are kind of atheistic in that way. You have, for example, the God builders in Russia, for example. That's a common case. You have Lenin writes this pamphlet against them. It's called Empiricism versus materialism versus empirical criticism, right? And he, the God builders, right? They basically thought, well, we're materialists, right? We're empiricists. Empiricism says that all that exists in the world is what I can see, is sensory data, right? It's what I can see, I can feel, I can touch, I can, sense, right? Well, if all of the reality is sensory data, then, who are we to say that somebody is wrong in what they sense? So for example, it's like, well, there are a lot of people who, believe that there is a God. And because they believe it, well, that makes it true because, well, are you saying that they're all lying about their sensory experience? All that exists is what, I see. And they said that reality is simply a compilation of people's sensory data. And Lenin said, well, no, that's actually not true. There's such a thing as, people could have, a mass hallucination, for example, or, if everybody suddenly decided that there were fairies that exist in the countryside and were kidnapping their children, would that make it true? Well, no. Actually, there is a real reality, and that you don't just get to define reality based on what you think, which is empiricism. And that, the Leninist and the Marxist critique of empiricism, of quote unquote traditional materialism, is that it's not actually materialist, because empiricists believe that reality is dictated by what they sense, which is a form of their thought. And they say, well, actually, no, there is a reality that exists outside of you, and that dictates the world.
Yeah, but that's a little bit simplistic because, and I don't want to get into this because I don't want to get away from Juche ideology, but I mean, a perfect example is force, right? And David Hume, who liked to play pool, had this conversation as an empiricist. He says, we know that if one ball hits the other, right, that it's going to move. It doesn't just go poof and turn into a dragon. It moves. And therefore, that's not a sensory thing. We cannot know that from our senses. Yes, we can see this as experience, but again, like I said, Hume is a perfect example of someone who says you don't see things like force, you don't see things like gravity, but they exist. So it's more than just our sensory. There is also the intellect and seeing patterns.
They call that is there something that is knowable? They call it I don't remember what the official term is called. I'm sorry, I'm tired. It's like synthetic. Okay. They call it a synthetic observation, right? And the argument is there such thing as non-synthetic knowledge that we can know? And the argument is like math, for example, and but I don't know if we want to get too deep into this, but
yeah.
I get kind of annoyed when people say, oh, well, like Marx is a materialist, and materialism means that there is no God. It's like, well, are you saying that you only believe in God because you've decided that you thought it? I kind of get annoyed by that. But anyway, then the next quote would be, in the mid-19th century, Marx and Engels propounded Marxism. Thus, they highlighted the historical mission and a path of liberation that had to be followed by the working class that appeared on the arena of struggle, and stimulated the fight against capital, ushering in the rise of the international communist movement. So he's sort of giving the history of the organization. Where does he's sort of giving their heritage, right? He's saying, well, this guy Marx existed, and he sort of started the communist movement. I'm trying to find where it is in the book. And then we can go to the next quote because it goes right into the next one. But Lenin developed Marxism and advanced Leninism in accordance with the new historical conditions, whereby capitalism had entered the phase of imperialism. The result that he inspired the working class and the rest of the people to the struggle to destroy imperialist strongholds. And to achieve freedom and liberation. This marked the beginning of transition from capitalism to socialism. Whereas our leader, that's the next quote, He's saying there's like sort of three. Whereas our leader created the great Juche idea after acquiring deep insight in the requirements of a new era, where the oppressed and the humiliated masses of people became masters of their own destiny. Thus, he developed their struggle for independence onto a higher plane and opened up the age of Juche, a new era in the development of human history. The revolutionary idea of the working class emerges as the reflection of the mature demand of history and the revolution in their development. When the leader embarked on the road of revolution, a new development was taking place in the struggle of the working class and the popular masses against exploitation and oppression. So, basically he says, well, Marx had this idea, right, of you have, traditional Marxism, you have the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, right, but that nothing really came of it. And he built the foundations of this, of this philosophy called Marxism, right. And he built the International Working Men's Association, but nothing really came of it until Lenin. And Lenin, he continued the class struggle, but what he really did was he mobilized working people to fight for national liberation. And really, it all comes to the zenith. It all comes to the zenith of Kim Il-sung and Juche, whereas, he transformed things by having this great insight. And that, really the Juche is the ideology that comes about in the era of national liberation revolutions that were happening in the third world. That sort of Juche as an ideology for the masses of people in their millions, and that empowers them to become masters of their own destiny. And I think we've said similar things about how Lenin was a better Marxist than Marx, and Stalin was a better Leninist than Lenin. That these ideologies they go through transformations. And in a way, I mean, like the Korean ideology, it sort of gets rid of a lot of the elements of class struggle, and it talks strictly about it in terms of national liberation and sort of empowering people to do the best for their country and stuff like this. So Mihir says, what about Mao, like in terms of Juche? Well, I mean, I'm kind of confused. Like, what do you mean? Like his importance, or like what about Mao specifically? Like, sort of.
I think he left the chat momentarily. I don't know. Here he is. Maybe he can clarify. Explain your question, Mahir, about Mao.
Yeah. So, are you able to hear me?
Yes,
we can hear you.
Okay. So, I just was interested in this because I was like researching about Juche, and it turns out that it was developed as the idea of self-sufficiency and just like North Korea being able to develop military self-sufficiency and ideologically self-sufficient. But then how does because it also, if you research it, it also brings up like the Sino-Soviet split between Mao and Khrushchev, I guess, the 50s. So like does what was Juche like in response to that, to the split, or was it like something that Mao also shared when it came to his vision for China? Or like, does it have a lot of similarities with Maoism? Yeah, no, Maoism is not necessarily, I mean, it's been used and abused by many so-called people and movements, but I'm kind of interested in how it intersects.
Right, that's a good question, because a lot of people would say Juche is universally applicable.
Well, China and the DPRK have very similar histories. They both come out of the Second World War as sort of anti-colonial struggles in response to the Japanese imperialism. Both of them have brutal civil wars where you have a faction that's sided, funded by the U.S., and then you have a side that's that is funded by the Soviet Union. Both of them became sort of unhappy with sort of the ways that Soviet advisors wanted them to act, and they felt that wasn't in the best interest of their country. But I mean, as far as the Juche ideology specifically, I mean, they get into where it comes about, but it's separate. It's separate from China, and you have to remember Mao and Kim Il Sung were contemporaries. That Mao was about 15 years older than Kim Il Sung, but the Communist Party of China takes power in around the same time as the Workers' Party of Korea. But yeah, you had the Sino-Soviet split, right? And you had factions, right? Because it is a communist country, and you had factions within the DPRK that wanted to align more with the Soviets, and you had factions that wanted to align with China. And that at various points in the DPRK's history, depending on what was best for the people of Korea, they would be a little closer to the Soviet Union. They would be closer to China. There were times where, for example, Kim Il Sung would be greeted as a great leader and liberator in North Korea. And there were times where you had, the Gang of Four leading protests calling Kim Il Sung a fat revisionist pig. That North Korea was it operated in a similar stance to Cuba, and that it stayed neutral in the Sino-Soviet split. You can argue that they're very similar in sort of history. Mao sort of went in an ultra leftist direction, whereas Mao sort of became, Mao sort of went in an ultra leftist direction, sort of became ultra left. You had the Cultural Revolution, which was a disaster. Whereas Kim Il Sung remained neutral and sort of took the Marxist-Leninist ideology in a new direction. That was sort of his response to the outside influence that he didn't appreciate. He said, well, we're going to do something different. And he broke with the Marxist label, and they have different beliefs about human beings and the nature of human beings. They have different beliefs about self-sufficiency. You talked about the military first policy. They've actually done away with that in recent years. Kim Jong-Un has repudiated that. They don't do the military first policy anymore. But yeah, does that sort of answer your question, or maybe other people have input?
Well, I would like to chime in here. I just think it's important to clarify the term Maoism. That was a term that was adopted in the 1980s. In China, they don't talk about Maoism. They talk about Marxist-Leninist ideology, and Mao Zedong thought is, the Chinese Communist Party believes in Mao Zedong thought. They also believe in Deng Xiaoping theory, and the three representations and Xi Jinping's teachings now have been added to the constitution. But China has never talked about Maoism. It was in 1982 that a group of communists who had followed Mao and didn't like Deng Xiaoping gathered, and they declared they were Maoists, right? And they denounced China, like China had lost the way. And so, in every major city now, and I did a stream about this, you have like a little club of teenagers who call themselves Maoists, and they all hate modern China, and they like the Gang of Four, and they are from that trend of anti-China, anti-Deng Xiaoping people trying to preserve the purity of Mao. And I think there's a group in New York City called Maoist Communist Union, and there's one in LA called like Dare to Struggle Los Angeles, and there was MCU. Red Guards of Austin, Texas, and and there's a bunch of them.
Captain
and
America, part of the MCU. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, and it's just that those folks, they call themselves Maoists, and when they use the term Maoist, they're basically saying that they're cut off from modern day China. They're trying to bring back the Cultural Revolution. They tend to really admire the Shining Path of Peru, which was a pretty extreme, awful group, and and such. And the Naxalites of India, right? The groups in India, that tends to be who they admire. And this is an ultra leftist trend, but for some reason it's very attractive to teenagers. I don't know why. It's like every major city now has a little tiny teenage Maoist club. 10, 20 years ago, these people would have joined the RCP and followed Bob Avakian, but now the RCP is kind of floundering. And so now there's just a million of these little tiny teenage Maoist clubs. And I did a YouTube slideshow about them. I thought it's kind of an interesting trend. So.
Well, I think it's interesting for some reason, Maoism on the internet is presented as this super edgy alternative to being an ML, because it's well, you don't actually, right? You still don't have to actually associate yourself with any existing communist country, but you also get to do the edgy gulag thing, right? There's that. And then also, before he was a communist, Mao called himself an anarchist, right, for a little brief part, because anarchists tended to organize the peasantry, and that there are a lot of anarchists who do still claim that Mao is an anarchist, and he was attacked as an anarchist, by pro-Soviet elements at various times. And you know how like internet people, they love to put anarcho in front of words because they think it makes them sound smarter. So I think there's that element too, as far as why it's so attractive to teenagers.
Years back, I knew someone who was an anarcho-fascist. Not a joke.
Do you want to respond, Mahir?
Yeah, I mean, this is really bring a lot of clarity in this conversation. I mean, it's just so essential because like I mean, it just speaks to my own experiences when I was organizing, and a lot of us as young people. This was back when I was like 21, 22, in 2022, 4 years ago. I was with the Youth Against Displacement group within Chinatown, Lower East Side, and they were, they were not all Maoists, but like the main organizer, he was um always taught, like he would always send me speeches or links or like podcast shows that were very like just trying to bring back like Mao and the old way. And I just think that yeah, there's a lot. I mean, within these circles, I think they try to keep young people in a very weird kind of cultish, almost like in a frozen state where it's like you don't really do much in the organizing. And on this CPI is very different, and I was introduced to CPI by Irving, Irving Lee. He's one of our members and a close friend of Caleb. And this CPI is very different. We actually, I mean, we were out there just recently in the, you know, uh, against the British. We're going against the British on the day after, or the day before July 4th, and it's just we're doing something different. It's something unique and different, um, and it's a very positive organizing.
Oh, that's nice to hear. I mean, yeah, I agree. And we were out there, Mahir. We were out there in the heat wave. It was really hot out, and there was Times Square was very noisy, but we were out there doing stuff, and we're growing, and we have big plans for CPI. We have big plans. So I'm really glad
I'll just say while we're on this topic, and then I know we need to get back to the Juche. My biggest critique of the Maoists is that they are very much, it's all about violence. It's all about the state. It's all about the gun. There's very little talk of economics. There's very little talk of building a movement. It's all just kind of the way the society is now. It's racist. It's bad. And when we take over, it'll be good, right? It's a very, very shallow thing. And it's very similar to Blanqui, who was a revolutionary who was around at the time of Marx. He was a revolutionary in the sense that he felt bad for people and he wanted some kind of revolution. But in terms of an economic analysis of how the economy works, there's not much there. And that's how these groups are. It's just kind of everything's bad. And so we need to take over the government. And once we take over, then it'll be good. That's kind of the limits of their thinking. And they tend to fetishize Mao because he had a gun, because there's quotes in the little red book about, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. There's kind of a fixation on violence and they're kind of a lack of deeper analysis.
Yeah, and I think it is a very infantile teenage fantasy. I think too, there's like a lot of people in the DSA where if you talk to them, in my experience, they're like teenagers, right? And they have this fantasy. It's like, well, yeah, the political system is corrupt. It's like, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to play the game and I'm going to like be like an uber corrupt politician, but I'm actually going to be one of the good ones. I'm secretly going to have, and that's, well, I mean, that's not really how that works, but it's sort of this infantile, it's a Blanquiist, right? Conspiratorial sort of approach to things. And it's what they might call unscientific.
Well, in my experience debating Maoists, actually for CPI, is that a lot of them are really, at least the ones in the United States and in the West, they're really rigid on definitions of socialism and things not being real socialism. And then they're a little bit like Trotskyists where they pick and choose arbitrary countries to support. And then they have arbitrary criteria where they won't support China or they won't support whatever country. So it's a little bit like Trotskyism.
Right. Going back to North Korea, right? Bob Avakian, he says in his autobiography, he goes, well, I mean, I would never want to support a country. I would never want to live in a country like North Korea. It's just like bad vibes, man. Like that was his argument for why North Korea wasn't socialist. And it's something like Michael Parenti and others have pointed out. It's like a lot of leftists, right? They'll support Cuba, right? But Cuba has the same economic system as the DPRK, and the DPRK's economy is actually doing much better. But why is it that it's okay to support Cuba and it's not okay to support North Korea? Well, part of it is racism. Part of it is like, a lot of the imperialist propaganda is uber racist against the DPRK, and you can't really do that with Latin American countries and be okay on the left. Whereas Asians are quoted as like a model minority, and it's sort of okay to make fun of them. And also it's like, it's on the other side of the world. And Korea is very culturally different. So it's like, and plus, it's very easy to join one of the Vince Ramos brigades and visit Cuba to support the Cuban people and see that it's not that bad there. Whereas the DPRK is again on the other side of the world, and it's illegal to travel there. But it's certainly interesting.
Yeah, a lot of Americans speak Spanish. All the reasons you're saying are true, but yeah, there's definitely a double standard. No question about it.
But yeah. So yeah, we can go to our next quote. So the revolutionary forces too should be trained from among the masses, and all problems arising in the revolutionary struggle should likewise be resolved in reliance on their wisdom and strength. However, the communists and the nationalists who are allegedly engaged in the national liberation movement in our country in the 1920s gave no thought to the need to go among the masses to educate, organize, and arouse them into waging a revolutionary struggle. But divorced from the masses, they were only engrossed in the scramble for hegemony and empty talks. They did not invite the masses, but divided them in factional strife. Yeah, I mean, so what he's getting at is, I mean, and Mao complained of similar things, and I think of the struggle between the so-called Nazbols and the more traditional quote unquote communists in Germany as well. This was a huge problem with the Comintern. The huge problem with the Comintern is that the Soviet Union, that they were all tied to the Soviet Union, and in some ways that made them good. They took anti-imperialist stances. But in other instances, it hindered their ability to organize in the context of their country. The Soviet Union they had to have it their way. They had one line for all of the parties that they had to behave in certain ways, and they would bring in these advisors who could be quite bullheaded, who weren't really interested in getting to know the people. They just had they were just sort of like bureaucratic normies who like just wanted to do their job and go home, basically. As a result, I think of like in the US, there were things that happened, the way that the Comintern had to be a brand. And so they alienated people like Jay Lovestone. They couldn't work, with folks like Huey P. Long, who were socialists in Louisiana and stuff like that. And, I think of, it was definitely an error that was made. And I think that too, that's part of the reason why they emphasize, we emphasize, they emphasize the creative ability of mankind and stuff like that. Because I think that too, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on like going out and reaching ordinary people and propagating to them and getting ideas out there. Oh, because it's just material forces and, we're just going to like fight in the military or whatever. I think that was a part of it too. That, there was a feeling among some Soviet officials. It's like, well, if we just like make these countries reliant on us for infrastructure and stuff like that, well, like we don't really need to teach them the ideology, and we don't really need to win over their hearts. It's just like, they'll have a good impression of us, and then they'll become communists. That was sort of the Khrushchevist idea of the three peacefuls and whatever. We'll just kind of like do things better. And it didn't end up working out, and you ended up having to have like a real ideology that empowered people. But what do folks think on that? I know people have some thoughts.
I'll just real quickly add, because I know we're gonna about to roll in the video. later on, you know. But just what I want to quickly add is that I think it's very important. I mean, it speaks to the sense that like what countries and societies and our communities were really trying to strive for is like just being able to like like not rush towards like this hegemonical kind of like we want to dominate over others, but just more like a way of like being innovative, you know, like being changing like agents of change and just trying to do the best work for you know on all levels like locally. And you look into like countries and societies like self-sufficiency and developing own models like Ibrahim Traore and example of you know so other examples too, the Iranian system and of course like Juche as well.
Speaking of hegemony, I think of I think a huge problem was that, I mean, during the 20th century, you had two powers. You had the bipolar world, and both powers sort of saw the world as a chessboard, right? And they saw the countries, among them as sort of pawns on a chessboard, or at least that was the feeling that was given off. I know Soviet Union engaged in much more mutual development. The Soviet Union, was a much better ally to its allies than the U.S. was, although it was limited in what it could do, right? But I remember during the 2015 election, 2016 election, the reason that Hillary Clinton got the endorsement of like a bunch of the major Democrats, during the primary, one of the selling points was, oh, she sees the world as one big chessboard. That was the argument that they made. That was something I remember they said, and that was supposed to be a good thing. That she saw the world as this like global battle for hegemony, against like the illiberal forces of the world, and that was a good thing. Whereas it's like, well, these are real people who have wants and needs, and who, it's much more than a battle for hegemony, and you can get caught up in wanting your ideology to win or wanting one side or not to win, and you can forget that these countries all have their own interests and they all have things that they're striving for and wanting, and that the people of these countries are like actual people. They're not pawns to be sacrificed on a chessboard. And I think too of like, there are certain people who, they have a little bit of that ultra left thing in them, and they'll be like, oh, well, so-and-so country should just fight to the bitter end. Right. There were some people saying, oh, well, like, I don't know why, Iran would sign a deal with the US. I don't know why, Russia would want to negotiate with us. They should just like fight, and just like take it over. And it's like, well, people in that country might feel that way. But you having this like ideological thing in your head about how another country should act because of your ideology, that's very callous towards the people of that country and their suffering and their needs. I think you have to keep in mind that these are real people. That's something you can forget when you get wrapped up in an ideology sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. I've seen ultra leftists say like, why don't Russia and China intervene militarily on behalf of the Palestinians? I'm like, if Russia or China intervened militarily on behalf of the Palestinians, that would be considered another Holocaust, and it would start World War III.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, or they'll be like, oh, well, why does Russia or China, why do they have diplomatic relations with Israel? Or why do they have diplomatic relations with X, Y, or Z country that's like a pawn of the US or is committing atrocities? It's like, well, it's like they still have to exist. They still have to be a country,
I'm sorry. I'm probably, I don't agree with this. I mean, look, the China of today is not the same China as Mao. It's not as ideologically bent. And just like in the Soviet Union, you had a revolutionary period, and then you have the Khrushchev period, and it's more about trying to make to compromise with the West, and that's what's happening with China. As you mentioned, I mean, if China became more aggressive, we'd have World War III.
Well, that's one of the things I like about the Juche Study Group and about CPI is we have a lot of different views. We don't require everyone to have the same view on everything, like so many leftists and so-called anti-imperialist groups do. So it's good to hear both of these perspectives.
Yeah, we're not a democratic centralist organization, some of us believe in God, some of us don't. We have different positions on different countries. I mean, that's what makes CPI important. We're about educating for anti-imperialism, and it's kind of ridiculous in modern times to expect everybody to have the exact same line on every single country, and that's kind of unrealistic. And especially in the age of social media, right? It's like there's going to be differences when people speak, and we just have to embrace that. And in fact, it can be good to have different views out there, unified in one project to spread anti-imperialism.
And speaking of disagreeing with ideological perspectives and democratic centralism, here's we have a last quote. I believe it's our last quote. Okay. Oh, I didn't remember that one. Okay. He elucidated the truth that the masters of the revolution are the masses of the people, and that when one goes among them to educate and mobilize them, he will educate and mobilize them. One will be able to register victory in the revolution. This is one of the starting points of the Juche idea. The revolution in each country should be carried out responsibly by its own people, the masters of it, in an independent manner and in a creative way suitable to its specific conditions. And then we can go on to the next one. Marxists followed the evil practices of flunkyism and factional strife, which had resulted in the country's ruin in the past. They did not try to carry out the revolution by their own initiative, but dreamed of achieving independence by depending on foreign forces at that time, who were allegedly engaged in the communist movement formed by their own party groups and called frequently at the Comintern to gain recognition. And then since we're short on time, we can just, In his early years of revolutionary activities, Kim Il-sung was well-versed in Marxism-Leninism, but he did not confine himself to applying Marxism-Leninism to the Korean Revolution. Instead, he pioneered a new phase of revolutionary theory from a steadfast Juche-paced standpoint and resolved the problems arising in the revolutionary practice from a unique angle. He discovered the truth of the Juche idea in the course of the struggle against bigoted nationalists and bogus Marxists, flunkyists and dogmatists, while hewing out a new path for revolution. Finally, he explained the principles of the Juche idea at the meeting of leading personnel of the Communist Youth League and the Anti-Imperialist Youth League in June of 1930 and put forward the Juche-oriented line for the Korean Revolution. This was the historical event which heralded the creation of the Juche idea and the birth of our revolutionary line. So, yeah. So speaking of disagreements and he disagreed with Marxism-Leninism. He didn't think it was enough, and so he put out the flunkyists, and the dogmatists. And so I think without further ado, I think we can go into our last. We have a video that we want to show, and then we can wrap it up because we're a little short on time. But we'll see everybody next week.
To celebrate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and the establishment of the American Republic.
Came out here today to Times Square to talk about the American Revolution, to talk about the legacy of 1776.
Iran is not our enemy. Iran is not our enemy. Iran is not our enemy. Iran is not our enemy.
Our roads are falling apart, and despite this, we have a tremendous debt that we cannot pay back because of these wars.
1776, what happened? Freedom from tyranny.
What are these countries doing to us that you have to go kidnap leaders, murder leaders, for what?
Because we love our country.
Yes.
And it wouldn't be necessary to be out here in Times Square right before July 4th if we had people in the White House and people in the Congress who loved our country. But we don't. We got people in the Congress and people in the White House and people on Wall Street who don't love America. They're loyal to an international financial system, and they're waging war after war after war around the world to keep Wall Street rich while America gets poorer. And as the Wall Street bankers fill their pockets with derivatives and rip-offs, we get poorer every day. They're unpaving the roads as billions and billions and billions of dollars go overseas. It's an absolute disgrace. 1 in 4 American children goes to bed hungry every night. 1 in 4 American children is chronically food insecure.
Americans are sick and tired of war.
The United States got their asses kicked out of the Middle East by Iran. They're out, okay? All the military bases are totally destroyed. Thanks a lot, Israel. Thanks a lot, Israel, for starting that war and getting Dumbo Trump into it.
Now, we had the Second American Revolution, and that revolution created civil war and the abolition of slavery. This is critical for our economic development.
We love our country, and that's why we're against these wars, and that's something a lot of people don't seem to really get.
Genocide and murder, as in Gaza, where we have supported a mass murder for 3 years of tens of thousands of innocent people. And every day it gets worse and worse. They are now shooting children. They're burying them alive. And this is the group of war criminals that the U.S. Congress has decided to merge with.
And they're driving a policy of war and controlling our presidency to push for more war and get the United States troops involved.
Happy July 4th, everybody. I want to talk a little bit about the legacy of 1776, because there's a lot of liberal jibber-jabber out there. There's a lot of media out there, the 1619 Project and others, that would try and convince you that somehow the American Revolution was a reactionary thing, that it was a bad thing, that somehow the benevolent British Empire was some awful thing for us colonists to break love from. What was the reality of the British Empire system? What did the British Empire system mean to the people of China in the century of humiliation? What did it mean to the people of India who had their people starved and locked millions of people in intentional famine?
American heroes said from July 4th, 1776 was resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. Well, we need to say that again. We just need to add that resistance to Zionism and the state of Israel, that is also obedience to God.
The U.S. can actually make peace with Iran, and it's for the interest of the American people. And it's in the interest of the American tradition in terms of, anti-interventionist, domestic focus.
And have a new government for working families.
That's right.
One that will invest in education, housing, jobs, the economy, and not pillaging and again raping and murdering everybody here and across the world, literally.
We spent billions and billions and billions of dollars on a stupid war with Iran that had no reason to happen. Iran didn't do anything to us. Iran wasn't trying to get a nuclear bomb. There was absolutely no reason to attack Iran in February except to enrich the pockets of Wall Street bankers and to make Israel feel more secure in their crimes against the Palestinian people.
40 years of triple rents, and nobody said a word about it, right? That means you are losing your property rights. They're taking away your right to land and liberty just by having triple rents. 3 times what any normal society would put up with.
That the wars around the world that we are fighting are for an economic system. The American people know their leaders are not loyal to them, to their constituencies. They're loyal to an economic system, and they're loyal to their donors, be that AIPAC or other donors.
True patriots would never send Americans to die for Israel. True patriots would never send Americans to die for Wall Street and for London. And that we're the real American patriots. We need to declare independence from the British Empire system. Russia is not our enemy. China is not our enemy. Iran and the Palestinians are not our enemy. Our enemy is Wall Street. Our enemy is Jeffrey Epstein. Our enemy is the international bankers that are grinding our country into poverty while they enrich themselves. And we're here as the true American patriots, standing against Wall Street, standing against their ugly wars, and fighting for working families. We're the Center for Political Innovation. You should check us out.
He has systematically wrecked this country's military reputation and destroyed this country's moral reputation as well.
And there are so many people out there that would try and convince you that somehow the British Empire was a friend to black people in this country. It is the further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was the British Empire who threatened to park their navy and break up the Union blockade of the South. It was the British Empire. It was the Wall Street bankers who were funding the slavocracy of the South. And it was Russia. It was Russia who brought their navy into New York Harbor and parked their navy to make the statement that the oppression of black people in this country would not go on.
This means a lot to me personally because in my family, my mother's side is Iranian, and it's very, it's very important. Even though it can be divided a little, people have divided opinions here and there, but it's really important that as an American, I'm born and raised in New York City, lived here all my life, born and raised in the Lower East Side, and the whole point is that, we want no more wars.
There's Jews living in Iran peacefully, and 25,000 Jews. You have Christians living there, just like you had Christians living in Assad, Syria, before the Zionist-backed Syrian rebels led by Ahmad al-Shah exterminated them.
There's a lot out there saying, oh, America's an idea, America's an idea. Joe Biden gets it, he says, oh, America's an idea that we export onto other people through violence and death and destruction. Absolutely disgusting concept. The American people are a real people rooted in the foundations of the land of this country. And the American people do not want war. The American people don't want to export some abstract ideal of so-called freedom, the freedom to go without food, the freedom to go without health care, the freedom to go without infrastructure. No! The American people want housing. The American people want health care. The American people want education. And that is really the legacy of 1776.
We should try for win-win cooperation instead of gunboat diplomacy.
Reclaim the revolution!
That's right.
Reclaim the revolution!
That's right.
And the Democrats are no better than the Republicans.
That's right.
When are people going to get it through your head? You're being deceived.
U.S. Navy people and U.S. Marines walking by, and I noticed that a lot of them would read our signs, and I saw a couple fist bumps. I saw a sailor take a picture with one of the Iranian flags. I mean, they seem to support them. I would say, the people who are most against the wars in this country are our veterans, because they are the people who have to fight them, and because they really love our country and they want it to be a better place. And that's, I think, why they enlisted in the first place. And they can see that that's not what they're really doing.
To talk about the injustices of the wars that this regime has propagated, not just on Iran, Venezuela.
People walking by were giving us thumbs up. Saw a lady give the devil horns, doing the rock on sort of thing. The Center for Political Innovation, I think, is it's really something special. I think it's really something special. I don't think any other organization could come out here and do what we're doing today, making the point that we're proud to be Americans. I mean, a lot of leftist groups, they would come out here and maybe they would make similar points, but they would make it in a way that would be as alienating as possible. They would make it seem like these veterans are the problem or something like that. And I think that the fact that we're able to do this is really special.
Zionism is not Judaism. It has always been considered a heresy in Judaism. The very first anti-Zionists were actually the Jews, Orthodox Jews, because they ruled it is forbidden to have a Jewish state before the coming of the Messiah.
CPI is an organization that is committed to the truth through education to wake up the masses.
CPI, Center for Political Innovation, is an anti-war network that talks about rebuilding America, innovating to rebuild industry, rebuild prosperity for the United States, and working with the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, and being part of the multipolar world.
To make sure to wake up more people to see, these countries are not our enemies. Our enemy is Wall Street, first and foremost.
Impoverishing Africa, we should be doing what China is doing in Africa and developing African countries and making sure that they can be viable trading partners. That would be fulfilling the legacy of 1776. That would be fulfilling the legacy of the American system and not the British Empire system that is about making sure that other people are poor so that you can stay rich.
The Mali is really doing okay. Burkina is doing okay. Niger is doing okay.
And Russia is helping.
Coming together.
Russia's helping, yeah.
Russia has really been a great help. Russia has been a very great help in terms of equipment, in terms of even international politics. Russia has really helped a lot. Russia and China, and Iran and Turkey.
Van Damme, a socialist would want to roll back the rent to normal levels. Okay, not just freeze the rent, roll them back to what they were affordably 25% of your income.
Not our enemy. Iran is 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 not our enemy.
Offering community to all these people who have come here today. I mean, this is something that has really been life-changing for me, to be able to come out here, make friends like Irving, make friends like Caleb and Mahir and Paul, and all these people. These people are my family, I love them, and it's really awesome that we're able to come out here and do this and stand with the American people against the system.
The military of the United States will now be merged with the genocidal state of Israel. Ooh. What a disgrace! Terrorists will
That's right.
And I got the sense that people were really, really supportive of us.
We are the true patriots of this country. We are against the imperialists. We're against the big international monopolies. And we want a government that invests in the American people. A government of action that fights for working families. Not a government that serves Wall Street and London and the profits of the super rich. We need a government of action that fights for working families. No more wars to enrich the 1%, the billionaire elite, the Jeffrey Epstein class.
So I think this is really the new norm of the world. America needs to really wake up to know who to deal with. Because it's not about, I used to be partnered with this one. Where is your partner going? If they're going astray, you need to change, because everybody needs to defend their own interests first. So America really needs to defend their interests, becoming alliance, becoming partner with those alliance countries. You know, becoming friends, becoming partner with developing countries, with countries that really have a clear vision. Not with Europe, that is really funny. Now Europe is very kind of crazy right now. They are waging wars here and there with no reason. So I think America does not win in partnering with them.
That's right. Instead of relying on brain drain and picking the pockets of the intellectuals of around the world so that they don't have professionals to develop their industries, we ought to have a government that empowers the American people and sees them as an investment. We want to invest in our people, and that is what 1776 is about. We need a third American Revolution. Yeah. We need a third American Revolution.
Dare to struggle, dare to win. 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 Dare to struggle, dare to win.
Thanks for watching, everybody, as always. I hope everyone has a great night.